Natalie Haynes is a broadcaster, writer, patron of Humanists UK. You've read probably at least some of her novels. If you haven't, they're all on the stand outside, so you've got the opportunity to rectify this omission. And her most recent book is a retelling of the story of the Trojan War. So forget all those depressing topics like the peril of the Human Rights Act and Brexit, and prepare for something much more cheerful. War, grief, death from the ancient world. So, this latest novel, which is absolutely brilliant, it was a joy to read, very moving, harrowing at times, actually.
Harrowing to write, are you kidding me?
Harrowing to write.
Yeah, well,
Is her microphone on? It is.
I can't be held responsible for the microphone. I
No.
can't touch them because I'm like the Incredible Hulk. I seem mild-mannered, but I just break things the minute I touch them, just so you know.
Well, the book certainly was heartbreak. Don't touch me, basically. I'm broken enough after only one evening of the conference. So, the book, 1,000 Ships, is, as I said, a retelling of the Trojan War. So, Natalie, tell us a little bit about what the book is about, and then Natalie is going to do a little bit of a reading, and then we'll have some conversation both about the book and the ancient world and its relevance.
1,000 Ships is my epic. I wrote two Greek tragedies before this, one contemporary one, Amber Fury, and one set in the ancient world, The Children of Jocasta, which was my retelling of the Oedipus story. And I'd wanted to do the Trojan War for a while. And then I was walking home from the park. Andrew and I both walk, ridiculous, bless you, numbers of miles. Sorry, I have hay fever as well, so I'm being sympathetic to the hay febrile. Also, I just like to use the words hay febrile in a sentence because people so rarely do. I wonder if there's a reason for that. Yeah, there might be. We both walk millions of miles, and I was walking home from the park, and I was going past the running track, and I thought, if I was going to do the Trojan War, what I would really like to do is have a timeline through the middle of it that's basically Euripides' play, The Trojan Women, which is the women of Troy, the women who've survived the sack of their city, immediately after that's happened, basically sitting on the shore outside the ruins of their home, waiting to be enslaved, waiting to be divvied up and taken off to different parts of Greece. It's a especially cruel feature of war in the ancient world, that you kill the men and you enslave the women and children. So not only do you lose your husband and your safety and your identity and everything, but you lose exactly a way of describing who you are, that you're no longer a Trojan, you're somebody who used to live in Troy, because Troy doesn't exist anymore. So now you're a Greek's slave. You've lost everything about it. And I thought, I want that as the spine of the book. And I would like to do the causation of the war backwards and the consequences forwards. And I want to do the whole thing from the perspectives of all its women. This is going to be my epic. And I don't want to tell a story from one or two women's perspectives. I want to do all of it. I want to do the story of Odysseus told from Penelope. I want to do the way the war starts, and who's responsible, and at what stage the goddesses, and it's almost always goddesses in this war, are responsible for which, we all mostly know the story of the judgment of Paris, but we focus on Paris in that descriptor, and why would we? It's the judgment between three goddesses, between Hera and Aphrodite and Athene, and yet we only focus on the guy. And I was like, the women are right there in the story, and if no one else is going to do it, and I walked home like, somebody must have done this already. It's such a cool idea. It would be so much fun to do. And I was fizzing by the time I got back. I was like, and Googling frantically, like, somebody must have done it. And I was like, is it mine? Can I have it? Is it my idea? Is it really? And so I mailed my publishers and said, this is what I want to write. I want to do this book with multiple timelines moving in different directions and different points of view. Is that fine? And they went, yes.
Oh, did they? I mean, they said yes straight away.
They did.
Yeah.
They said yes off a page. But I had already written Jocasta at that point. So yeah. I'd earned it.
There are at the moment, I mean, it seems to be something in the zeitgeist at the moment, this retelling of ancient stories from the perspective of women.
And other marginalised characters. I mean, the Song of Achilles, Madeline Miller's beautiful novel, obviously looks at the love story between Achilles and Patroclus. And, I know that reactionary, furious, not only men, were very angry about the idea that Achilles and Patroclus might have had actual physical sex, because the idea that you might put homosexuality into the Greek world is obviously bizarre. But you only have to look at book 18 of the Iliad, where the news of Patroclus' death is brought by a man named Antilochus, I think, to Achilles. And he tells him that Patroclus is dead, and Achilles, the greatest warrior the ancient world ever knows, collapses to the ground. And Homer tells us that Antilochus is worried he'll slit his throat. Well, sure. I mean, they might just be pals. I suppose if you're desperate to genuinely believe that men can't love other men, then that's a way you could read it. But the Greek is right there, as far as I'm concerned. And I think there's been a huge kind of pushback when Emily Wilson translated the Odyssey. She was the first woman to publish a translation of the Odyssey, and it came out almost 2 years ago. And it's a tremendous piece of scholarship, quite aside from anything else, a tremendous piece of poetry and translation and everything else. But, predictably, right-wing commentators of a sort were saying, well, this is outrageous. She's rewriting the Odyssey. Well, there's a scene famously in the Odyssey where Odysseus comes home to Ithaca, spoiler, and you've had 2,500 years to read it. This is on you now. This is not next week's Game of Thrones. That's too bad. And he hangs all the slave women who have, as he perceives it, conspired with the suitors who've been trying to seduce his wife. They're slave women. They have absolutely no capacity to reject these men. They're slaves. Women get raped all the time now, let alone in the ancient world. Although, of course, there are more slaves now than anyway, let's not go down the slave rabbit hole, and let's not use that sentence ever again. But in translations, when I reviewed Emily's translation, I found 3 or 4, just from the 20th century translations, which translate the Greek word for female slave, which is all that there is in Homer, as slut or whore or slattern. And it's like, mate, she's not making it politically correct. She's taking out your misogyny that you've imposed onto Homer.
And how have you found that telling your story from the perspective of the women changed it?
Change the story?
Change the flavour of the story.
It was a really interesting thing to do, because in some cases we know loads about a woman, but she's incredibly contrastingly shown. So, for example, we know loads about Helen. Helen is so integral to Troy as a war that she's the only person to whom we've appended the suffix of Troy. She's pretty important to the whole affair. But the versions of her that are maybe were most used to me were all in Euripides. Euripides wrote 8 plays about the Trojan War, which we still have today. 7 of them have women as the title characters. Just to give you an idea, when people go, but isn't it anachronistic putting women into the center of the story? I don't know, you should ring Euripides and tell him. And his version of Helen in his play, Helen, hasn't been to Troy at all. She's been to Egypt. She spends the whole war blamelessly in Egypt, and the gods send an image, an Eidolon, in her place. So she gets slated as being the sluttiest girl in all of the Greek world, and yet she's completely blameless. The version of her in The Trojan Women is incredibly articulate, like a lawyer, sitting there explaining to Menelaus that he's lucky that she, eloped with Paris and blah, 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 blah. It's just fantastically clever and smart-mouthed and unapologetic. And so you get these kind of multiple versions of her, and it's exciting and interesting working out who she's going to be. In the Odyssey, in Book 4 of the Odyssey, when Telemachus visits, and I had to miss this out of my book because it's too mad. When Telemachus visits Menelaus and Helen in Sparta after the war is over, he turns up and says, "Have you heard anything about my dad? He's been missing for 20 years. And they go, "Oh, let's tell you about him in the war." And Menelaus starts to get very sad and starts to cry. And Helen doesn't say anything to him. She summons a slave woman and gets her to bring her a bag of stuff that she's been sent from her friend Polydamna in Egypt. And she takes the drugs, which they are. Homer calls them nepenthes, grief-banishing. And he explains that you could see your parents cut down and you'd be completely fine. So I think we can call these class A's. And she puts them in the wine and then gives it to Menelaus. And I thought, I really want to do a chapter where I explain that Helen spends the whole of the rest of their lives giving Menelaus rohypnol every night. But it's going to seem weird. So I had to put it to one side and just say, no, she's, the muse refuses that bit of her story. But there are other characters like Penthesilea or Laodamia. Penthesilea is the great Amazon warrior queen who comes to fight at Troy. She comes to support Priam as an ally. She doesn't have to. Because it's not her war, but she comes to do it anyway. She fights Achilles. And And her story was told in the Aethiopis, which is a great epic poem that doesn't survive to us today. And it's a particular loss to classicists because it tells the story of Memnon, the great Ethiopian hero, and it tells the story of Penthesilea, the great female hero. So whenever people are going, meh, 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 classics is all about dead white men, it's like, and also, but we don't have it. We have fragments in Quintus Smoneus. And so that's where I kind of pieced her story together from, and from pots and vases and things like that. You can find all kinds of brilliant things. So picking out the bits of women were always in these stories, and in Euripides they're front and center, but often they're in the story, they're just around the edges of the story. Or we didn't value the story. Laodamia, the story is in this, and she gets a whole poem to herself in Ovid, but that whole book of Ovid I didn't even get taught at college. I don't think you did either.
No.
Because it's all about women, so who cares?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think, without trying to find a way of saying this without saying that your book is better than Homer's Iliad, but...
Not my words, ladies and gentlemen. The official position of the Humanists.
It could go on the paperback. But
I did outsell him the week it came out. I was the #1 selling epic in the country. I was like, yes.
Oh, you outsold him for 1 week?
Yeah, I outsold him for 1 week. Yeah, I'll tell you why, because he didn't do BBC Breakfast or Woman's Hour. Lazy. Lazy Homer.
But it is better than Homer's Iliad. And when I was reading it, one of the reasons I thought it was better is that the stories of women were actually just more interesting.
They are amazing stories, and that's what Euripides realizes, of course.
Yeah.
That if you want to write about a war, you should write about the women whose lives it affects, because the way men interact with them and the way they interact with each other, because of the way those men interact with them, is astonishing.
Each woman has more stories that she's part of than each man does.
Yes,
because
that's
her
true.
life intersects with so many other
yes, I think
different
that's
women
true.
lives.
And also, and it sounds like quite a sort of backhanded point, but it's true, I think, is that for the men, the war ends when one of them dies. For the women, it just doesn't. They're going to be, you have to trace the story of someone like Andromache, or Briseis, or, these women are basically passed from man to man, depending on who dies at any given moment, and they never have any agency. And so all you can really do is follow them through this torment, and take them to where they sort of eventually need to get. And it is a very strange thing. The men just almost opt out.
Yeah, by dying.
By dying,
All right,
yeah.
It's
Because
the
there are
easy way
worse
out.
things, it turns out, than dying, right? I mean...
Which bit are you going to read to us before we get...
Oh, it's up to you. You can either have
I'm going to have a vote.
Okay, we can do a vote. So we can have... we could have the Judgment of Paris. It's a little bit smutty. I'm just letting you know so you know. Nudity occurs. Or you can have the bit
Only
where...
in the story. It's not going to happen.
On stage, nudity won't occur. I might get out like a shoulder or something if you'd like to see what 90s grunge lesbian stripping looked like. I suppose that would help. Thanks.
I think
for
that's a
whoever
subject
laughed
on
at
which
that.
we'd probably be polarised.
Or you can have Odysseus' men being turned into pigs.
Who wants men being turned into pigs? Let's see hands for that. No one.
No, some
people. And who wants the smut? Yeah. Very reliable crowd, these humanists. Put the smutty bits in Greek.
Do you know, a few years ago, I had to do an event called the Cheltenham Booker, in which at Cheltenham Book Festival, you do the Booker Prize for a year before the Booker Prize existed. And my year, that year, we were doing was I was doing Grapes of Wrath, and somebody was doing Finnegan's Wake. And it was so, and I've judged the Booker Prize. I can read a fucking book, but it's so impenetrable that in the end, all I could do was just tag the smutty Latin in it, because those were the only bits I understood. And then during the event, I said, I can't understand any of it except the smutty Latin, but I've marked all those pages, and I auctioned my copy off for charity, for a literacy charity, for £25. Yes, pre-marked. Help yourself, smutty Latin. Anyway, James Joyce is not for me, I think it's fair to say. So, the goddesses Athene, Aphrodite, and Hera have been at a wedding, and they have behaved poorly, let's say, when a golden apple on which the words Ter Callista, for the most beautiful, has been presented amongst them. It rolls onto the floor. And they all want it, and they can't decide who should get it. And they ask Zeus to decide, and he quite sensibly does a runner, because there is simply no win for him here. And he spirits them away, and they reappear on Mount Ida, which is just outside Troy. And a nearby sort of shepherd boy named Paris is given the job of judging between them. And I think that's where we'll start. Aphrodite stamped a small foot. "She said you have to choose, and you do," she said. The words seemed to slither across the ground between them and wrap themselves around him like snakes. "Who does the apple belong to?" "I don't know," Paris said. "You can criticize me for indecision, but the truth is, you are the three most beautiful creatures I have ever seen. There's so much distance between you and any mortal woman that I can barely perceive it. It is like asking an ant in his underground nest to tell you which mountain is tallest. I cannot." "You need more time," Athene said. She was determined he shouldn't see that she was delighted the apple wasn't already in her sister's hot little hands. "Can we help you with your decision?" There was a brief pause. "I can help," said Aphrodite. And she wriggled until the brooches which held her dress in place at the shoulders worked themselves loose. The dress slid down to reveal her naked form, and Paris looked as if he might choke on his own tongue. "Oh, really?" said Athene. "We're doing this." She reached up and unfastened the brooches on her own dress, standing tall and willowy, nude but for her helmet and her spear. Hera said nothing, but she too was suddenly naked. "I can't," Paris faltered. "Can't talk?" Aphrodite asked. "Can't breathe," he replied. He grappled with the ties on his Phrygian cap and worked them loose, casting it onto the dry ground. His hair was plastered to his head. "Has this helped you make your decision?" Hera asked him. He had not noticed before how deep and throaty her voice was. "It honestly hasn't," he said. "Almost the reverse, actually." "Zeus brought you here to decide," she said. "You must choose." "I need a moment," Paris replied. "Is there a spring nearby? I could do with some water." "You can have something to drink when you've made your choice," Hera said, so kindly that the threat was almost entirely concealed. She took a step towards him, and it took all his power not to step back. "Let me make things easier for you." If Paris had been able to focus on anything but her glowing face, a hand's width away from his own, he might have seen Athene and Aphrodite rolling their eyes in sisterly annoyance. "The apple is for the goddess who is the most beautiful, as you see." Paris had almost forgotten he was holding the apple, though now its weight seemed to pulse with an inner heat. But beauty in a goddess is different from beauty in a mortal woman. It's not just about appearance, it's about ability. I am, as you can see, very beautiful. Paris nodded weakly. He thought for a moment of saying something about how surprising it was that Zeus had ever strayed from Hera, given her extraordinary radiance, let alone that he did it over and over again, but something in her glittering eyes told him that this might not be received as the compliment it was intended to be. "I am not only beautiful," she continued, "I am also extremely powerful. I am the wife and sister of Zeus. I dwell by his side at the top of Mount Olympus. My favor builds kingdoms, my disfavor crushes them. You must choose me." Paris felt his hair shudder upright, as though he could feel her non-existent breath on the skin of his neck. "Choose me, and I will give you dominion over any kingdom you desire, any of them. Do you understand? You can have Troy, if you want it, or Sparta, Mycenae, or Crete, anywhere you like. The city will bow before you and call you king." She stepped back, and Paris swallowed. "Are we really going to?" Athene glared at Hera. "Fine." She stepped forward into the gap which Hera had left. Paris could feel sweat beading on his temples and in the small of his back. "You don't need me to tell you that you should give the apple to me," she said. Her grey-green eyes were so different from Hera's, Paris thought. Hera's were so dark, so brown, that a man could lose himself in them like a cave. But Athene gazed at him with a frank intelligence which made him feel suddenly her equal, hubristic as he knew the thought to be. "Hera offered you a city of your own," she said. He did not speak, but she heard him just the same. "A kingdom? She really does want that apple you're holding." "You're probably wondering what I can offer which would rival that, aren't you?" Again, he didn't reply, but she did not even pause. "You're thinking that a kingdom might be more of a burden than a gift if an enemy decides to make it his own." Paris had in fact been thinking about her naked breasts, which were practically touching his skin because she was standing so close to him, but he forbore to correct her. And you're right, she said. A kingdom is nothing unless it is secure, and a king must be able to fight his enemies and win. That is what I can give you, Paris. I can give you wisdom, strategy, tactics. I can give you the power to defend what is yours from any man who would take it from you. What could matter more? Give the apple to me, and I will be your defender, your advisor, your warrior. Is that your owl? He asked, as the tawny bird flapped across the clearing and settled on a rotten tree trunk to his right. You cannot have my owl, she said, and thought for a moment. I will get you another owl if you want one. Thank you, he replied. It's a tempting offer. Athene nodded and stepped back beside Hera. The owl flew over to her and perched on her outstretched arm. Athene stroked the feathers on the back of its head, and it pecked gently at her hand. Even though he was watching her, could not help but stare at her, Paris did not see Aphrodite move. She was suddenly behind him, in front of him, all around him. Her hand stroked his arm, a glancing touch, and he felt like his legs might give way beneath him. He had never wanted something so much in his life as to simply fall to his knees and worship her. Her hair, like sun on sand, was wrapped around him, and he tasted salt on his lips. You know the apple is mine, she said. Give it to me, and I will give you the most beautiful woman in the world. You, he asked. Not me, she replied. I would destroy you, Paris. You are mortal. Paris wondered if destruction would be such a terrible way to die. I will give you the closest thing to me. Her name is Helen of Sparta. He had a sudden image of a woman of extravagant beauty, flaming yellow hair, white skin, a swan-like neck, and then it was gone. Aphrodite shimmered away like spume on the surface of the sea. Paris looked down at the solid golden apple nestled between his fingers and thumb. He looked back up at the three goddesses who stood before him, and he knew it had only one rightful owner. As the goddesses returned to Mount Olympus, Athene swore she would never speak to either of them again, especially not Aphrodite, who radiated smugness as she cradled the apple in her spiteful little hand. You didn't tell him Helen already has a husband, Hera murmured. She preferred to take her revenge at a leisurely pace, so refusing to speak to her tormentor would serve little purpose. It didn't seem important, Aphrodite replied. Besides, how much can it matter? Paris already has a wife.
We'll come soon to some questions from everyone here, but I wanted to ask a couple sort of only tangentially relevant to the book. Was it your first book, The Ancient Guide to Modern Life?
It was my second. I wrote a children's book before that.
Children's book, of course.
Called The Great Escape with cats in it. But yeah, Ancient Guide was my second
Ancient
book.
Guide. And you've obviously followed that through your career, not only your novels, but also your very successful Radio 4 show. Natalie Haynes stands up for the classics.
Coming back for season 5 this Christmas.
Excellent. What is it, do you think, maybe riffing back on your first book after the children's book, what is it that gives the ancient world its enduring appeal even today? Because, there are other periods in history between then and now which aren't given as much attention, which aren't talked about as much, which aren't out there in our culture as much.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, we're just extremely lucky to have what we have, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny fragment of the literature of the ancient world, but it's still wonderful. You know this, you read Latin and Greek. It's wonderful. We're so, we only have 7 plays by Sophocles. He wrote 150. We only have 7 plays by Aeschylus. We don't know how many he wrote. We've lost between 97 and 99% of literature from the ancient world, and yet the 1 to 3% that we have is mesmerizing. And because of that, you can study a whole culture because of the physical remains that survive, because of the stories that survive. I think it's very tempting to see our world and their worlds as impossibly far apart, and they are in terms of all kinds of cultural freighting. They are really, really, really different. And, there's that fantastic bit at the beginning of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War where he says, human nature being what it is, this is always going to be relevant. And he calls his, I can't remember it is a katerma ae, a possession forever. He says it'll always be relevant. And, who am I to correct Thucydides? I think 2,500 years on, he's right. It is still relevant. People do still behave that way. I do still. You must do this. When you see some cretinous decision being made in Parliament. Think of the
that's
Mussolini
just-
debate
yeah,
or
exactly.
the Melian dialogue or whatever. You go, oh.
But that's sort of my question. Is it the case that ancient Greeks and Romans are more like us than people in the Middle Ages were, for example? Because sometimes I think that might be true.
I mean, I think in lots of ways it is true, isn't it? And in lots of ways, like, for example, the position of women, of course it's incredibly distant and different from us. But yeah, in lots of ways, I think it is true, although we don't, there are still places in Britain where there is an almost feudal system, where, there's a landowning lord, and that's undeniably the case. But for the most part, we have more of us live in cities than in the country. We do have quite a metropolitan or urban
it's an
existence.
urban life, that's why it's similar, yeah.
Yeah, I think that is a huge part of it. And the Greeks were incredibly curious. That's why they have this period in the 5th century BCE where they invent, history and biography and drama and politics as we recognize them, and democracy and all of those things, and philosophy of all of those things as well in the 5th and 4th centuries. And it's partly because they are clearly ace, but it's also because they're just super curious. They live on the edges of land masses, like as Plato says, they're like frogs around a pond. So they live on islands or on the edges of places, and they're always sailing off and exploring. They're going off to the Phoenicians and stealing money and alphabets. They're coming back. And so they're going all over the world as they can get to it and bringing back all the ideas that they can have. They are incredibly magpie-ish.
them,
Yeah,
say now.
absolutely they are. So, yes.
Okay, so questions. Oh, hello.
You said early in your talk that the story of the men came to an end when they get killed, and the women get passed from one man to another.
Yes.
This struck me immediately as being an exact parallel of what is happening to the young Bangladeshi women who've gone to Syria. They're married to a fighter, the fighter is killed, and they're passed from man to man. And it's a really desperate story. I mean, I think you've romanticized it.
I'm glad you think that, having not read it.
No, I haven't read it. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then I appreciate your point, but I don't think it's very fairly made. And I think it would be inaccurate to suggest that classics isn't in any way relevant or helpful to this problem, not least because, for example, a production of Antigone was put on in a refugee camp with women from Syria. And you can hear a program about it on NPR, which I think is still online. And the woman who played Antigone was, I think, 24 or 25, and she gave this extraordinary quote. She said, "I am Antigone." And it's like, well, you're not really, are you? You're a mother of 3, and Antigone is a teenage girl, and you're in a refugee camp, and it's like, well, that seems like quite a reach to make. And she'd had to leave her brother unburied in the street when she left her home. So I think it's easy for us to be sitting here talking about this. These stories aren't relevant because I want them to be. They're relevant because the world doesn't change. And so when I take on the story of writing about women brutalized by war, I take it incredibly seriously.
Would you put your hand back up so they can see you? Yeah, right there. I mean, the bits, the parts of the book that deal with Trojan women as they get, dispersed are harrowing. They really are. I think it must have been a torment to write.
It was a torment to write. The story of Andromache, which I have no intention of discussing on stage because I cannot, took me about 5 days to write it in the first draft, and I couldn't speak to anybody for another 5 days after it. And when I edited it, I fell apart again. And when I did the audiobook of it, I cried as I read it. And I thought they would make me go back and do it again. And they said, no, it's okay. But of course, I'm sure there will be people who listen to it and consider it sentimental.
I'm sure not. Yes.
Thank you. How do you deal with detractors who prefer the more traditional interpretations of the classics?
I give them literally not a moment's thought. They should read the Iliad, I suppose, is the short answer. The Iliad's wonderful. The Odyssey is wonderful. Go and read them. I want you to. I long for it. I'll help you with your Greek, but I don't care if they don't like what I write. It's of no interest to me whatsoever, I'm afraid. Sorry, I know you're not supposed to be unapologetic as a woman at the moment.
Any critics want to step forward? Okay.
I wanted to mention that certain inequalities in a society that have always been there, such as women's inequality sometimes, abuse against gay or black people, have not been dealt with ever since records began. My suggestion to put to Natalie is, do you think it would be a good idea if we try and get a humanist MP elected in Parliament, or a humanist UK MP?
Well, there are, of course, lots of humanist MPs. There's an all-party parliamentary humanist group that brings together politicians of different parties who are all humanists. Are you suggesting that Natalie should stand for Parliament as the first official humanist UK MP? That's what he was suggesting. Would you like to inflict this torture on your son?
I think, yeah. I mean, I try not to. I try not to just bash MPs for the sake of it. I try and bash them for the things that they're actively doing wrong. But it looks like an absolutely horrendous job. I don't want to spend my life getting death threats, I'm afraid. I don't want to spend my life having to negotiate with people who are not just ignorant, but long to remain so. Essentially at heart, I am a teacher. That's what I like to do. I'm too lazy to do actual teaching where you have to do paperwork, because I can do a radio series and teach 1.6 million people at a time instead, and that's clearly more fun. So yeah, but that's what I'm going to. What is it that Aristophanes has Aeschylus say in the Frogs, that we need teachers to teach us when we're children and poets to teach us when we're adults. So I think I'll take that gig on instead, if that's all right. But I'll vote for you if you stand and you come and live in my constituency, if that's all right. Or I'll campaign for you. I won't. I hate going and talking to people, but yeah.
She'll be with you in spirit.
I will be with you in spirit. I'll get a badge made.
She'll get a badge.
I love a badge.
Who doesn't love a badge?
Idiots.
Okay,
and they are of no concern to us at all.
We don't worry about. Yes, there we go. Hand up again. So the microwave. What was it? Microphone.
Thanks. Natalie, I wonder if there are any classical writers whom you actually abhor and deplore.
Oh yes, who do you hate? Plato.
I don't hate Plato. I hate. I get so much trouble for saying this with playwrights, but I hate new comedy. I used to be a stand-up comic, and I love Aristophanes' old comedy, and I love satire, even Juvenal, who is the most misogynistic and homophobic writer of the ancient world, probably full stop, and I still love him because he's a brilliant jokesmith. But new comedy, Menander, Terence, and Plautus, Christ, Plautus, I can't
You'll probably have to
bear
explain
him.
a bit what
Plautus,
new comedy is.
So new comedy is what will go on to become the comedy of Shakespeare and the comedy of all comic operas. So basically, it's long-lost siblings. There's maybe a locket which identifies two people. There's a grumpy old man who's determined to marry his ward, but oh no, it turns out she's his daughter after all. It's fucking awful. It's endless puns, which I can't bear. And it's endless, mistaken identities. And Comedy of Errors is based on a Plautus play, The Nike Me. And I just can't stand it. I'm quite claustrophobic anyway. And being at any point in a story where you absolutely know what's going to happen and then you have to fucking live through it is, you might as well just put me in a shallow grave alive. I can't bear it. I feel like I'm going to claw my way out the whole time. I just can't stand it. So yeah, Plautus, he's on my shit list. We could do 80 series of Stand Up for the Classics and I will never, ever do Plautus. Ever.
What about for £1 million?
No.
No, okay.
I just don't need the money enough. I mean, I'd like it, don't get me wrong. But
where are you going with that? Did you say there was someone over here? I can't see. Put your hand up if you're over here. There you are. And then you. But you don't like Plato either, do you?
I do like Plato because his prose is beautiful. I know his ideas are difficult, but his prose is gorgeous. You can't deny it. And on things like beauty, and the Hippias Major is gorgeous. Don't be silly. You love Plato.
I hate him.
Natalie, I was allowed to give up Latin in order to play more violin music. And I'm 82 years old, and I know nothing about the literature that you're referring to. Where do I start?
Read Emily Wilson's Odyssey. Read Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. The Odyssey is a great adventure story. There are man-eating giants. There are cyclopes. There are women who turn you into a pig. There is a trip down to the underworld. The words are catabasis, by the way. There's a bored wife waiting for someone at home. There's the most fantastic exchange in all of Greek literature, really, when Odysseus goes down to the underworld and meets his dead mother. Spoiler. And he says, "Oh, I'm really sorry to see you here. How's everything at home? How's my father? How's my kingdom? How's my palace? How's my son? It's like, dude, your wife. Dude. It's like, she's literally the 9th thing he thinks to ask about. It's really poor form. And the Odyssey is wonderful, and Emily's translation is just beautiful.
Who published it? Who was the publisher?
I can't remember.
I can't remember.
Whoever it is, I'm not getting paid by them, as we can
No,
prove by
just
the fact that I
checking.
can't remember. But it's fantastic. And I would also say you should go and see a play if you get the chance. And I would always make it Euripides or Sophocles, because there's a lot of choruses in Aeschylus which aren't necessarily the fun bits for us. And if you get the chance, go and see Euripides' Medea. It's the greatest play ever written in any language.
Maybe
and no,
you
I'm
could
not
do
kidding.
a little reading list and we could send it round to
I
delegates
could do a
afterwards.
reading list.
If
Wait,
you
didn't
want
I
to
write The
teach-
Ancient Guide to Modern Life to
Yes.
save me doing that? But
There's,
yeah,
there's a good book called The Ancient Guide to Modern Life, which will get you started, by
but
Natalie
go and see
Haynes.
Medea. If you get the chance to go and see Medea, the monologue at the start of Euripides' Medea, where she talks about how awful it is being a woman in the, she's talking really about 5th century Athens, but in theory in the Bronze Age. And this monologue was written by a man, Euripides, performed by a man playing Medea, playing a female character, but still, to an audience almost certainly of just men at the Dionysia, which had been funded by a man. And that speech is so good on the subject of how terrible it is and difficult it is being a woman in a loveless marriage. It was still being read at suffrage meetings 102 years ago. Euripides is the fucking bomb, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes. He's the one waving like this.
Even I can see the waving.
Hello.
Hello.
So I was going to ask sort of a similar question, but I'd just sort of like to sort of riff off of that question. And going back to sort of talking about all these, Tory MPs who study the classics and clearly didn't get the right messages, my question is, as sort of someone who would be reading these things for the first time and sort of coming to the classics from a point of complete ignorance, how would you read them and think about them in a way where you could draw the sort of quote-unquote correct decisions, and how to sort of like apply these stories and this knowledge and this sort of tradition and sort of your life and way of being?
That is a really good question. I mean, don't do what I did, because so far it's taken like 30 years, and I'm not sure how much time you want to commit to this, if I'm honest. But I think the short answer is that we all need to read everything generally more critically, by which I don't mean poke holes in it. I mean think about it and think about where it is and what it's coming from and why. And the Penguin classics, for example, almost always have really good introductions written by really good academics that are not, I mean, some of them are quite dusty. Some of them are full of massive shade being thrown. Yeah, and you're just like, wow, you clearly had an axe to grind against somebody else's position, which is perpetually entertaining. But I think the main thing is that you read them thoughtfully, I suppose, which sounds like a really simplistic thing to say, but I think people now we've become so kind of immune to that, of just going, here's information being given to us, and it's not good enough. We all need to bring a little scientific rigor into our lives, but we also need to bring a little bit of historian rigor into our lives and question our sources. Who's telling me this? Why are they telling me this? What's the point of telling me this? So when, for example, Plato tells us that his ideal society is an extremely limited one. I know you don't, but you have to ask the question of why. Why is Plato so angry about, ordinary people having power? And the short answer is because ordinary people, a large jury of them, voted to convict his great mentor, Socrates.
No, it's because he's really rich and he can't bear the idea that a load of oiks are running the democracy.
That's not the only reason.
It's one of the reasons.
It's, the fact that all the literature that we have from 5th century Athens is written by rich men is obviously problematic, but all ancient literature, with the exception of like Sappho and Sulpicia, is written by men, and you wouldn't advocate that we didn't read it because there's not
No,
enough
but I
women
think
in
they
it.
should have stuck to poetry rather than politics.
Well,
If
you
that
don't
was
get
their
to
position.
choose.
No, I don't. It's a shame.
That's not how it
What would
works.
you have saved? This is a good question for classicists down the pub, actually, is if you could get to choose, what would you have... There are so many texts.
The thing we would save.
We were hearing last year, of course, if those of you who were here, or in Newcastle rather, not here, but at the convention, from Catherine Nixie, who wrote a very good book that was published last year, now, or was it the year before, called The Darkening Age, which was about the destruction of the classical world by Christians. And she caused some headlines. by comparing it with the actions of Islamic State, 2,000 years later, which is a good comparison. But she referred then to the, hundreds of thousands of texts.
97 to 99%.
Yeah,
We've lost 99% of Greek literature, 97% of Latin literature.
And so there's a nice game that you can play, which is what would you save, because we know some titles of some things that were lost. What would you save?
Can I have two?
You can have one. You can have two. Go on.
I want Aristotle's... now there's a good answer, though. Read Aristotle. I mean, it's always a really good start. If you want to know what when somebody once knew everything about everything, it's Aristotle. He's not good on human biology. He thinks you've got humours. Don't believe that. But he's excellent on everything from, literary criticism right the way through to beekeeping. And the reason he knows so much about beekeeping is because he has a hive made out of the thinnest mother of pearl, so he can see the bees inside it. He thinks it's a king bee, not a queen bee. But that is not a stupid mistake to make at a patriarchal society at the time. It's quite a sensible mistake to make. But I wish we had Aristotle's treatise on comedy from the Poetics, which is lost, because I think, and have long thought, that people underestimate comedy as an art, because if we had the other half, we have the half on tragedy, we take it really seriously, we don't have the half on comedy. I would have loved to know what Aristotle, not a famously humorous writer, thought about comedy. But there's a fantastic pair of books, which I know you have read at least the first one of, The Lost Plays of Greek Tragedy, and the second volume of that by Matthew Wright came out last year, which the first volume looked at lost playwrights, and the second volume looked at lost plays by people we know. And there's a Sophocles play about Helen, and there's this fragment, and I'm still slightly reeling from it because I only read it a few months ago and I was writing about it at the time. There's a fragment about Helen, and she is sitting in presumably Sparta at this point, after the war has finished, and she's scratching her face open with writing implements, with pencils, something like that. And the idea that Sophocles was writing a scene of self-harm in which the world's most beautiful woman destroys that beauty with the exact tools which men, at the time only men, have used to make her the world's most notorious woman, I think is the most, even by the standards of ancient literature, it's like being punched in the gut reading. It's like, oh my God, did you write that 2,500 years ago or 20 minutes ago? And that whole play, of course I want it. I can't think about anything else. I haven't thought about anything else since I read it.
Next book?
The next book is non-fiction, and it's called Pandora's Jar. And it looks at the fact that women in Greek myth, you'll be unsurprised to hear, have been hopelessly traduced by bad translation, Judeo-Christian interpretations. Pandora didn't have a box, she had a jar. She's mistranslated by Erasmus. And then Judeo-Christian writers, and particularly artists, make her Eve, so she's evil, and it's just not in the Greek. It's just not in the Greek. There is no visual representation of Pandora in the ancient world where she has any receptacle at all. There are versions of her story when the jar is full of good things. There are versions where she opens it. There are versions where her husband opens it. And somehow it's always fucking her fault. So do you know what? No.
Natalie Haynes, everybody.